Hi everyone, my name is Junyan.
And my name is Ashwin.
Our research topic today deals with perceived gender bias and its influence on pronoun use.
So, what does it really mean when someone says gender bias? Gender bias occurs when an individual unconsciously attributes certain gender stereotypes to another person or group, leading to a tendency to prefer one gender or another. When we talk about gender, we need to talk about personal pronouns because that is the primary way that we address other individuals. In English language, we primarily use three personal pronouns: he, she, and they. Traditionally, he is meant for the male gender, she is meant for the female gender, and they is meant to be a plural. The current trend in how people use pronouns to refer to other people seems to be changing. Pronouns are now used in a way that is more gender neutral in an effort to be more inclusive of non traditional genders. Some examples in line with these trends include the gender neutral way of using they.
So how would gender bias and gender pronouns relate to each other? And if they are related, how would a person's political ideology influence them? So these are the questions we want to answer in our research. So political ideologies are ideas on how people should govern a country. As a side note, in the US, there are three main political ideologies: conservative, liberal, and independent. So these were the only types of political ideologies we measured as we saw that the most pertinent, which leads to our research question. So our primary research question is that does perceived gender bias affect pronoun usage? And our secondary research question is that does a person's political ideology correlate with how they view gender biases? So why should we care about these questions? Research showed that the use of gender pronouns like singular he and she could reinforce gender biases and gender roles. The question of gender bias is very important in our daily lives. We constantly tend to rely on these biases and schemas to make judgments in uncertain situations, which although can help us make decisions fast, may not be accurate all the time and can be detrimental. This can play out to gender bias by analyzing how people use personal pronouns to refer to other people's gender in uncertain everyday scenarios.
To study these situations, we can understand the role and the extent of gender bias in society. The first research question is important because it can help us in realizing how we are prone to conceptualizing gender and how this can further help us to make changes to society's traditional norms to make it less gender biased and more inclusive of all genders, including members of the LGBTQ plus community. The significance of the second research question is that it analyzes any potential interaction effects that can be caused by one's political ideology. We think that a person's political ideology can indeed, to some degree, influence that person's view of gender and therefore affect how they portray gender bias, especially in their usage of personal pronouns to refer to people. Now we're going to talk about a little about our research design.
So we had 13 questions for our coaching survey, and 10 of these require participants to fill in either she, he, or they pronouns in order to complete the sentence to the best of their ability. The three conditions that we tested were male bias question, female bias question, and neutral questions. There were three each of female bias and male bias question, and four neutral questions. And here, this is an example of a female bias question. So when you think of a nurse, you think of a female.
The remaining three questions are made up of two attention check questions and one question at the very end of the survey asking about their self-reported political ideology. Both attention check questions asked content-related questions based on a former question that appeared before. And this is an example of a attention check question. We collected 60 responses in total for our survey. However, we only kept 35 of them after cleaning out the data. We abandoned the responses that got both attention checks wrong or abandoned identical responses or left responses blank or had abnormal responses, like if, for example, if they spammed spaghetti for every single question.
So here comes the exciting part, data analysis. So first, we tried to find out if there was indeed a relationship between gender biases and pronoun use. So if the relationship existed, we also want to search for a connection between a person's political ideology and their degree of gender bias. So this is a graph showing the spread of the three personal gender pronouns used within each of the three conditions: female bias, male bias, and neutral condition. We could clearly see that participants answered she the most in female bias questions, and he the most in male bias questions. And it's also interesting to notice that people answered more he's than they's in a neutral condition. It's important to note that our primary research question is important because by answering this question, we can clearly see that a gender bias condition more than likely leads to a gender bias responses. So this was in line with our initial predictions.
Now that we know that gender bias is related to gender pronoun use, we can move on to answering the next question, political ideology. This first graph shows data from the male bias condition across all three political ideologies that we've collected. You can look at the percentage spreads of the three gender pronouns as they're used by different participants from the three political ideologies. And as you can see, people who answered he the most regardless of political affiliation for all male bias questions. This graph shows data from the female bias condition across all three political ideologies. There was a similar pattern to the first graph in that people answered she the most regardless of political affiliation for the female bias conditions. And this graph shows some interesting results. In the neutral condition, people who identify as independent or liberal were significantly more likely to answer they, especially independents. This is in comparison to conservatives who answer he the most instead of they. This is important because it shows that people who identify as conservative for their political ideology are more likely to show gender bias even in neutral conditions, which in turn influences their gender pronouns that they use when referring to other people. This proves that there is in fact a connection between political ideology and gender bias, thus answering the second research question. As stated in the last slide, the result above is important because it shows that the people who identify as conservatives for their political ideology are more than likely to show gender bias even in neutral conditions.
To conclude, there are some key takeaways from this study. The first is that people are more likely to use gender bias pronouns in gender bias scenarios while referring to people. This is important because it shows a link between gender bias and pronoun usage. This finding also shows that the importance of gender-fair language, since it could be promote inclusivity and acceptance for all genders.
The second is that people who identify as conservatives are less likely to use gender-neutral or singular pronouns like they than those who identify as either independent or liberal in terms of their political affiliation. This is important because it proves that there is indeed a link between political ideology and gender bias, and that political ideologies can indeed influence one's gender bias and therefore gender pronouns.
Thank you for listening.